Good evening and welcome. We welcome you all who are here present tonight, and also those of you who are attending this concert via live stream. Thank you so much for coming as we celebrate our feast day of our patroness, Saint Gertrude. I am also grateful for this opportunity to share the stories and tell and play the music of these awesome three women composers who all had tremendous ties to Chicago: Florence Price, Margaret Bonds, and Lil Hardin Armstrong. Tonight, we begin with our first composer, Florence Price. She was born in 1887 in Little Rock, Arkansas, and was born into a very unique situation as her family highly valued education, hard work, and perseverance. As a matter of fact, her dad was a very successful dentist in Chicago, but unfortunately lost everything in the Chicago fire. So after the fire, he and his wife, Florence Gulliver, moved to Little Rock, Arkansas, and started their family there. And although Little Rock was segregated in the 1880s, it was a unique situation in that it was sort of a haven and a drawing place for educational blacks. Many first-generation families who had just been released out of slavery. So this was the situation that Florence came into, and she went to good schools. Her mom was her first piano teacher, and she had the values and work ethic that would become necessary for her to have success later in life. She displayed at an early age a tremendous talent for the piano, and then pursued her advanced musical studies at the New England Conservatory of Music. Here, she studied organ, piano, and composition, and her composition teacher, George Chadwick, was also unusual in that he really believed in the school of nationalism, which meant he believed that America should foster their own musicians, conductors, and composers. At the time, the prevalent thinking was if you needed a good conductor or composer, you went to Europe. But he was, no, I think we have good musicians here and we should be developing our own. So he encouraged Florence to compose and to compose that which she knew. And what she knew was the African American tradition of spirituals, folk songs, folk dances, syncopation. So she incorporated these elements into her compositions and forged a unique compositional style. She graduated with honors, and then upon graduation went back to Little Rock, where she met a handsome young lawyer, Thomas Price, and they got married, started a family. But unfortunately, Little Rock now at this time was no longer the same as the Little Rock of her childhood. The Jim Crow laws were in effect. There was a lot of racial tension and segregation. Life was difficult. And finally it got to the breaking point where Florence felt her family was in jeopardy. So she and her husband and their two kids got on a train in the middle of the night and came to Chicago. And this is where she spent the rest of her adult life, really. Chicago was a tremendous environment for Florence and opened up a lot of new doors for her. Although, again, it was a segregated city, there were a lot of unique opportunities for black musicians to perform and to have their works heard. There were black music schools, black symphony orchestra. There was even a women's symphony orchestra with whom Florence maintained a lifelong relationship. So Florence worked initially in Chicago as a music teacher, a choral director, was active in the black community churches. But she was very surprised one day when she came home from work and found that she had won first prize for a compositional contest that didn't know she entered. Unbeknownst to her, her husband had submitted one of her compositions to a publishing company and she won first prize. So after getting over the shock, she decided to develop a lot more time and energy to composition and to really make a serious go of this. And her efforts paid off huge dividends. In 1932, she entered the Rodman Wanamaker music contest, and she struck gold. She won $500 first place for her symphony in E minor, and first place for her piano sonata in E minor, which was another $250. This piano sonata was very unique in that it was the first time a sonata ever contained a spiritual. If you think of the works of Beethoven and Mozart and Haydn, it's sort of hard to imagine a spiritual in those works. But she pulled it off beautifully, and in a few minutes I'm going to play the second movement from that sonata. The following year, in 1933, she had won enough attention for her symphony in E minor that the conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, Frederick Stock, wanted to perform it at the Chicago World's Fair, which was called the Century of World Progress Exhibition. Then, in 1934, her piano concerto in one movement, Florence played the piano part as a soloist for the commencement ceremonies for Chicago Musical College. Later that year, her student and protégé, Margaret Bonds, played the piano part at the Chicago World's Fair under the baton of Ebba Sundstrom, who was the conductor of the Chicago Women's Symphony Orchestra. Florence stayed in Chicago and continued composing and performing until her death in 1953. Chicago even honored her by building an elementary school and named it after her in 1964 at 4351 South Drexel. Unfortunately, it's now closed, but the building is still there, and it's called the 21st Century Community Academy. During her lifetime, Florence composed over 300 works, many spirituals and vocal arrangements of spirituals. Unfortunately, none of her large-scale works were ever published during her lifetime, but she is enjoying a renaissance now. People are recording it, and there are new CDs of her symphonies and her piano concerto. So I would like to play for you now the second movement of her award-winning piano sonata, and it's just a gorgeous, beautiful, lush melody of a spiritual that she wrote, and follow it up with a very up-tempo piece. She wrote a set of dances called Dances in the Canebrates, and the first one is called Nimble Feet, and this is a very lively, boisterous, up-tempo dance, very syncopated, rhythmic, toe-tapping type of piece, and it's called Nimble Feet. So the second composer I'd like to introduce to you tonight, Margaret Allison Bonds. Margaret was born in 1913 in Chicago, and her mother, Estella Bonds, was a very well-known musician and prominent figure in the African-American gospel and black church scene. So much so that her home was like a magnet for other African-American artists of the day to drop by. So people like poet Langston Hughes, soprano Abby Mitchell, composer Florence Price, composer William Dawson. All these people would come by, drop in on their home, and Margaret just soaked this all up. So as part of growing up, she had a very strong sense of identity of the African American culture, and as a result, it became a lifelong mission of hers to spread the joy and the beauty of this culture to the rest of the United States and the world. So she displayed an unusually precocious talent at the piano at an early age and wrote her first composition called the Marquette Street Blues when she was only 5 years old. She continued with her piano studies. She studied actually with Florence Price for a while and helped her write out orchestral scores for some of her symphonies. And then she furthered her advanced studies at Northwestern University, where she studied, got her bachelor's and her master's by the time she was 21. She was an amazing, amazing pianist. She also entered the same contest that Florence had entered, the Rodman Wanamaker contest, and submitted her vocal composition, Sea Ghost, and won first prize in that category. In 1933, Margaret appeared with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and became the first black soloist to appear with that orchestra, as she played John Carpenter's concertino for piano. The following year, she played Florence Price's piano concerto in one movement with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra at the Chicago World's Fair in the auditorium. She worked a lot with Florence and was very active in the National Association of Negro Musicians. After graduation, she tried to establish, it was called the Allied Arts School in Chicago, but because this was right after the Depression, economic times were really bad, and she wasn't able to make that successful. So then in 1939, she moved to New York, and that's where she spent most of the rest of her adult life. In New York, she furthered her compositional study at Juilliard and studied with Roy Harris. She taught piano, she composed, she performed. She had appeared on a weekly radio show. And in all, she wrote over 200 works, from spirituals to symphonies, jazz, musical shows, a ballet, a mass in D minor. So she developed her own unique style of incorporating blues and jazz and Western traditions with some of these African American traditions. She set many of the poems of Langston Hughes to music, including Ballad of the Brown King, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, Three Dream Portraits, and Shakespeare in Harlem. And several of those pieces are available at the Chicago Harold Washington Library. Her song Peach Street appeared in the movie Gone with the Wind, and her song Spring Will Be So Sad was actually recorded by Glenn Miller and Woody Hermanson. In 1967, she moved to Los Angeles and taught music at the Los Angeles Inner City Institute. Also in 1967, she received the prestigious Northwestern University Alumni Merit Award. This really meant a lot to her. It was sort of an affirmation of her life's work of bringing and celebrating the African American culture worldwide. And it really felt like her life had come full circle. In 1972, she witnessed her premiere under the baton of Zebin Mehta and the Los Angeles Symphony Orchestra, who gave a performance of her credo for chorus and orchestra. Unfortunately, she died a few months later, unexpectedly, before her 59th birthday. So most of her works are vocal in nature. She set many spirituals to music, even had some commissions by Leontine Price. I did find a piano suite. It's called Spiritual Suite, which is her rendition of 3 different spirituals that I'll play for you tonight. The first one is her arrangement of the spiritual Dem Bones, Dem Bones, Dem Dry Bones. This is different than probably what you're used to hearing. It starts off kind of eerie and sort of strange chords, and it starts to build up. And then she switches from this eerie mood to something sort of a little jazzy. She changes the rhythms and starts introducing some jazz chords, and then a left-hand rhythm comes in, a left-hand melody comes in softly, and again another, it builds up, and then we get into a rock and jazz blues. So it has a lot of changes to it. And it ends with the piano tremolo, vibrating basically like shaking bones. And the second piece is just a gorgeous arrangement of the spiritual Peter Go Ring Dem Bells. She uses the entire register of the piano. You can hear bells up in the upper right hand. You can hear bells in the left hand, the thumb. It's really stunningly beautiful. But then in the middle, she changes key, changes meter, and it becomes a waltz in E flat major. And the melody is in the left hand. Then she kind of builds to a crescendo, comes out of that, goes back to the original setting and key and time, and ends loudly with the bells ringing. And then the suite closes with her a fantasy on the spiritual Wade in the Water. This is by far the most difficult of the pieces. It opens up with a left-hand riff, sort of something, rumbling in the water, and the melody comes in, but it's very syncopated and it has sort of jazz-like chords and highly accented. Builds to a big crescendo, and then it again morphs in the middle to something totally different. She changes keys from E minor to E major, and all of a sudden you would think you're listening to a piece by Debussy or Ravel. It's very dreamy and ethereal and sort of far off. It's quite stunning, the contrast. And she comes out of that and builds to a big crescendo again, and now the two hands are doing sort of a call and response back and forth, and another rumble begins in the very lowest registers of the bass and builds all the way up to the top and ends with a flourish at the end. So now I'll play for you the Spiritual Suite, arranged by Margaret Bonds. So finally, we get to our last composer, Lil Hardin Armstrong. Lil Hardin was one of the most influential women in early jazz. At a time when women, especially black women, were relegated to being singers or dancers in a chorus line, Lil had a serious career as a jazz composer, a pianist, a band leader, a singer, and an arranger. Lillian Hardin was born in 1898 in Memphis. Unfortunately, her father died at a very early age, but her mother was determined to give her daughter a proper education and the tools that she would need to succeed throughout her life. She displayed an early talent for the piano, and of course she lived just a few streets beyond Beale Street, where all these jazz sounds were emanating. But Lil's mother did not care for jazz music at all and was determined to make sure that her daughter grew up studying classical music. But there was always some of this jazz in the back of Lil's personality and mind. But she continued with her classical music and went to Fisk University. And then when she was 19, the family decided to come to Chicago and spend the summer in Chicago with some relatives. And this is what changed Lil's life forever. She loved Chicago. She was just so in awe of the big city and the sounds and the music and everything magnified on a tremendous scale. And particularly, she was drawn to this large music store called Jones Music Store on South State Street. And it had all the top tunes of the day in sheet music on racks on the wall. And it even had an old man there demonstrating, the music in order to try and help with the sales. But Lil didn't think too much of this guy's playing, and she went up to the owner and said she could do a better job, and she auditioned and got the job. So she went home and told her mom, and her mom wasn't overjoyed at first, but she thought, oh, it's just a summer job, she'll probably be okay. So Lil, went to work every day at Jones Music Store, and this was also a unique place because a lot of musicians from the South were coming up for the Great Migration and looking for work. And she met pianists like Jelly Roll Morton and started to really pick up this jazz style. Plus, the owner of the store also booked musicians in gigs around town. And one day, a band owner came by and said, his pianist who was sick and couldn't make the gig, and he was really hard up, needed a pianist, and he looked at Lil, he said, you could do the job, why don't you just fill in for me tonight? And she was like, oh yeah, that would be awesome, but then she thought of her mom. But this was just too big and good an opportunity for her to turn down. So she said yes, and kind of told some fibs to her mom, and did the job. No music, played by ear, just was swinging with the band, loved it. Well, there was no turning back for Lil at this point. She was hooked on jazz, and she kept the roost going for a while, but eventually her mom did find out and was very upset. But she kind of gave in. Lil by this time was an adult. So Lil started playing around at these jazz clubs in Chicago. There were a lot of great clubs around 31st and State Street. And Lil was a very sought-after pianist. And eventually she got hooked up with King Oliver's jazz band. One day King Oliver sent for his trumpet player back in New Orleans, Louis Armstrong. And Lil could not understand what was this big deal, Louis Armstrong coming. When we think of the Louis Armstrong of 1921, was definitely not the Louis Armstrong that we think of today, who was the polished, suave, sophisticated singer and jazz musician. The Louis Armstrong that arrived in Chicago in 1921 was kind of fat, didn't dress well, had a bad hairdo, was extremely shy. But Lil did recognize how well this man could play the trumpet like she had never heard before. So a relationship ensued, and one thing led to another, and they eventually got married, which again was a very sore spot or point with her mom. They were very happy, they're living together, working together, and Lil is generally credited with persuading Louis to be more ambitious and to break out on his own, to stop, playing second trumpet. She said, I don't, envision myself being married to a second trumpet player all my life. You need to get your own band. So eventually he did. He broke it off with King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band and started forming his own band, and his career really launched and took off. As a wife to Louis, Lil worked with Louis, getting his ideas down on paper, publishing the music, providing a strong rhythmic foundation as his pianist in the band, promoted his stardom, and built up his confidence. Her tireless efforts and craftsmanship made Louis' great Hot 5s and Hot 7 recordings big sellers. She played piano and sang on those recordings and composed several of the group's major hits, including Struttin' with Some Barbecue, Two Deuces, Just for a Thrill, and Hotter Than That. However, Louis's frequent travels throughout the country did not lead to a happy marital life. She and Louis were separated in 1931 and eventually divorced in 1938, although they remained friends for the rest of their lives. Lil continued to be very active in music in Chicago and New York after the divorce. She was the leader of several other recording groups, including Lil's Hot Shots and the New Orleans Wanderers. In addition, Lil finally did finish her music degree and got a diploma from the Chicago College of Music and the New York College of Music. She went on to lead bands in New York and performed in the Broadway revues Hot Chocolates and Shuffle Along. During the late 1930s, she functioned as a house pianist, composer, and vocalist for 46 Decca recording sessions. Lil moved back to Chicago in 1940 and worked mainly as a pianist and entertainer. Lil Hardin Armstrong was without a doubt a great jazz musician who made an indelible mark on early classical jazz. An independent woman who forged her own path through the male-dominated world of early jazz and the race-segregated culture of America before integration. She co-invented jazz with Louis Armstrong and was one of the most sought-after jazz pianists in Chicago. Throughout her life, she remained devoted to Louis's career, and he frequently sought her advice in business matters. When Louis Armstrong died in 1971, Lil was truly devastated by his death. They had been more than husband and wife. They were musical soulmates. 7 weeks later, on August 27th, Lil was invited to participate in a memorial concert for Louis Armstrong at the Civic Center Plaza, now the Daly Center, in Chicago. Lil played a very spirited rendition of W.C. Handy's St. Louis Blues. The song ended with a loud ringing chord until the last resonance of the song could be heard, and then Lil paused, put her hands on her lap, and she keeled over and had a massive heart attack, and although the paramedics arrived quickly, she was pronounced dead on arrival at Wesley Memorial Hospital, which is now Northwestern. She ended up her life doing what she wanted for whom she wanted. And with Louis's death, her story was over. So I'd like to play for you two songs that she composed that were big hits in her lifetime. The first one is a slow blues piece that she wrote when she broke up with Louis, and it's called Just for a Thrill. But I can't leave you on a sad downer note. And then even though it's not really barbecue season here in Chicago, I will switch to one of her major hits called Struttin' with Some Barbecue, which makes a very cute analogy between Dixieland music and tasty barbecue. Change my sunshine to rain, just for a thrill. You gave my heart, you gave it a pain. To me, you were my pride and joy. But to you, don't you know I was only a toy, just a plaything, just to toss around at will, just for a thrill. You know you did me wrong, just for a thrill. Well, you made my life one sad song, but now you're free and you're having your fun. But deep down inside, don't you know I'm the only one, just for the thrill. You made my heart stand still. My pride and joy, but to you I was only just a toy, just a plaything, just to toss around at will, just for a thrill. You know you did me wrong, just for a thrill. You made my life one sad song, but now you're free and you're having your fun. Down in my heart, don't you know you're the only one, just for a thrill. You made my heart stand still. with some barbecue, and I'm swinging with the band, like the happy people do, way down in Dixieland. You hear that old trombone and the trumpet at me. Love to hear that lick while I do my picking, picking on a juicy rib, 'cause I'm strutting with some barbecue, and I'm feeling mighty grand. That's another helping, please, of that good old Dixieland. Mr. Waiter, please, another rib or two, and I can strut, strut, strutting. I'm strutting with some barbecue. Some barbecue, and I'm feeling mighty grand. Pass another help, please, of that good old Dixieland. Mr. Waiter, please, another rib or two, and I'm strut, strut, strutting, strutting with my barbecue. I go strut, strut, strutting, I'm strutting with my barbecue. Thank you everyone again for coming and tuning in tonight. Hope you enjoyed the program. There is on the website a sheet of resources if you want to learn more about any of these composers. Thank you again and have a nice evening.